Hello, and welcome to the Good Grief Believer podcast. I'm your host, Chris Frazier, and I am here with Genevieve and Cameron, and they are going to tell us a little bit about their story. Hi, guys.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having us.
So, first of all, I guess just tell us a little bit about yourselves, kind of a brief life sketch, who you are, where you're from, how you came to be where you are now, and just kind of let us get to know you a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess we can start with when we met. We met at Gonzaga University in 2010. We were both attending school there. I was on the baseball team, and Genevieve was on the golf team. So we met in the athletic department and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. We were both a part of that group, and so dated and were married a few years after college, and took a job in Central Washington. Worked there for a little while. Which is where our story kind of originates. It's what we'll talk about a lot. And then soon after, we moved to Coeur d'Alene area, which is where we reside now. So that's the overview. I'm going to fill in gaps.
Sure. So we met at Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and I'm grateful to God that was the case, because we had kind of that faith connection from the start. And I was minoring in philosophy, so being presented with a lot of big life questions, and Cameron and I really kind of started our relationship off in a deeper way. Ironically, we weren't attracted to each other at the beginning. We weren't even considering dating one another at the time. And then over time and developing, through service and through our Christian faith, we really started to see each other in a new light. And I'm so glad that God put us together.
That's awesome. I love that. So tell us a little bit about the person that you've lost. Any special connections, or just, kind of give us the rundown?
Well, I think the reason Cameron and I kind of start our story with our marriage is that not long after, only about 3 years into our marriage, we lost our second son, Clark Job. We had a 2-year-old, and then we became pregnant, and pretty early on, we found out that he had a diagnosis that was incompatible with life. So sadly, we lost him at birth, but we were blessed with nine full months with him in the womb, and we really made the most of it. But we certainly consider him one of our children, and we look fondly on that time. And yeah, Clark Job, a piece of us in heaven, our second born son.
That's tough. As a mom who's also lost a child at a very young age, I can totally sympathize with how hard that is. My heart goes out to you guys for sure. So what was it like finding out that early? Tell us a little bit about that. How did knowing affect the rest of your pregnancy? What was that like, just finding out? Most of the time when people get pregnant, they're excited and it's a happy thing. And then, to get news like that, I'm sure that was super devastating. So.
Yeah. Well, I remember pretty distinctly of when we found out, and Genevieve had called me from the appointment, and I wasn't able to be there. And so she just said, there's something wrong with our baby. And, those words still kind of echo. But we were a little bit innocent in some ways and naive, because, thinking back, there were definitely signs that we didn't see, like on the ultrasound and things like that, where it was pretty invisible. And so, it felt like we aged pretty quickly once we found out what was going on. And, the journey began of trying to enter in and joy and love on this boy as long as we could while he was in utero for these 9 months we had him. And that was really kind of our focus after we found out. I mean, after the grieving process a little bit, and then that continued, but really trying to just enter into that process with him for sure.
Yeah, and I always hold, we've had children, following his loss, and I'll admit I always hold my breath when there are ultrasounds. It's just once your idyllic vision has been taken away, and you realize that what a miracle it is for all of the things to be well in a new life. Those hurdles can feel pretty extreme, pretty scary. But initially, we were just kind of young and naive, and went to all of our appointments. And again, sadly, I found out alone, and I think it took me a little bit to process alone. And then once I realized just how dire this was, how helpless we were, Cameron and I continued to go to these appointments together, just realizing how badly we needed each other. We also were faced with a couple of conversations from doctors who felt that there was no other option in their opinion and in their moral scope, that there was no other option but abortion to spare our suffering and to be able to start a new life again, So there was that encouragement, and we just really held fast to our faith and our love for this little boy and trying to trust God that this was part of his plan. And I certainly needed Cameron in the room, realizing that these conversations were going to continue to come up over and over again. And we really kind of relied on each other to be strong.
But yeah, we had some difficult conversations. And again, going back to like that philosophy that we had through our education and the way our families raised us, I hope that we made a difference for that particular doctor, because at the time when he was pushing for abortion, I think the doctor felt like this is the only thing I can do to help this family in the situation. So it was almost like, this act of mercy. But it didn't help our grieving. It didn't help the situation that we were in, and it didn't help make us feel supported. So we kind of had to go back and forth and debate. And I'm grateful that Cameron and I both felt, one, convicted to, hold on to our son. If he was living, then we would choose life for him. And two, to kind of try to defend that stance towards someone who thought we should end his life. So yeah, so it was a wild ride.
Yeah.
those weeks and months. Yeah.
I can totally identify. That's
yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So I was thinking when I was hearing your story, how was the grief with his diagnosis different or the same than the grief that you experienced after he was born? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, what was it like then, like before and after, I guess, like before birth and after birth? The same? Was it different?
I think there's only so much you can prepare for. And so the grief during the pregnancy was difficult, but honestly, after he passed, that was when we realized just how difficult death was, just how difficult seeing your body or your child's body lifeless was. And we hadn't experienced that yet. So, going back, we ended up transferring doctors and getting a supportive pro-life old Christian doctor who had been there, done that for about 30 or 40 years. So this was not his first time seeing a child, pass or with deformities, et cetera. And after Clark died and at that final checkup, he did say to me, this is one of the most difficult ways to lose a kid. And he kind of communicated why. He said, you're grieving for 9 months and you're bearing your child, and it's talk about on the forefront of your mind, every kick, all the things, every compliment in the grocery line. You are grateful for those things, and you know that you're not going to get to enjoy that life later down the road. So it's just a strange wrestling of love and grief and questioning, miracles, all of it. So that doctor was very sweet, just in acknowledging you've been grieving for effectively, I think it was 7 months in terms of when we found out, 6 or 7 months. And now you're going to be grieving, for years and forever and always. So I think it was very different, and the grief of knowing what's to come and then actually having to face it and live life without that person. But I wouldn't wish either one of those phases on anyone.
Yeah.
It's certainly difficult. I would say the postpartum life was extremely difficult, obviously, on the mother. And, there are just things that the world doesn't think of unless you've been through it, like your breast milk coming in and having no child to feed, when another person's baby starts crying or you hear ghost cries. There's such a thing where your mom intuition knows that there should be a baby there. Living with the postpartum body and the highs and lows and the hormones, while also wanting to just sit at your child's graveside and never leave it, or having to take care of your other children that are alive and trying to spare them of your pain. So I think the aftermath was certainly the hardest. And interestingly enough, we look back fondly on the pregnancy itself, huh?
Yeah, in some ways, that's what I wanted to mention. I said we went out into the desert, and I meant that, in the first day, but in some ways that's what it was, those 7 months, when Jesus went into the desert. And, all throughout the Bible, it mentions this, where it's like, that is like a proving ground or a preparation for something. And then, all in the saints and all in the church tradition speaks of how suffering actually drives you closer to God. And that was one of the first times we've experienced that in action, where, I think we'd both probably say that was one of the most purifying, but also simultaneously uplifting times of our life, because we were so desperate and hungry and in need of God, and more so than we've ever experienced. And so it was almost a beautiful time in a strange way, while it was obviously torturous, somehow both.
I 100% identify with what you guys are saying right now. You were preaching to my heart. I felt very much the same, it's literally the hardest thing I've ever gone through, but it's also the one reason why I know without a doubt that Jesus is real. He's aware of us. He knows us. He loves us, and he will never leave us comfortless. Without this experience, I would not know that. I would think it. I would be like, yeah, okay, sure. I believe that. I was, I grew up believing this and thinking this, but like you said, that was the proving ground, that experience was the solidifier. Totally. So how do you guys respond when people ask you how many children you have? I know this comes up a lot when we interview people who have lost children, and it's always kind of a interesting take to see, different people have different ways of approaching it. So what do you guys do?
Yeah. Well, I like to answer with the full number. I have had some very early miscarriages, and I've kind of, in order to not make everyone scratch their heads, like, why don't you have 10 children right here? You're telling me you have 7, things like that. I kind of, depending on the conversation and how much the person even cares to know, I will give either the answer of the physical children who are there and present, or I will add Clark. Most often I will say we have 7, because we have given birth to 6 boys and just had our 7th, who is a girl. And it's kind of a cute nod to the tribe that goes before her, and also that the perfect number is 7, and little Luciana's number 7. So I typically own that number. And then, if there's an opportunity or an openness or a questioning, I'll say that we have 5 boys here, 1 daughter, and 1 boy in heaven. And I'll kind of pen it that way. Yeah.
It's situational for me. Like in my business dealings in real estate here, it's usually people are a little bit more surfacey when it comes to conversational style. And so they'll say, oh, how many kids do you have? And I will usually just say 6, because then they, oh, what are their names? What are their ages? And then, it depends on how much they want to actually know. I kind of try to save that for if people are truly wanting to get to know us and want to understand who we are and what drives us. And inevitably, the more we converse with people, the more that comes out. And I'm comfortable sharing it, but in general, I usually find myself saying 6. Just interestingly, though, when I say that, it always flashes in my head, and that Clark always flashes in, and I say there's 6, but there's Clark in my head, but just more for simplicity's sake, in the sense of getting to know people initially, maybe not scaring them off right away or something like that, being definitely embrace that as soon as people are willing and able to talk through that with us.
Yeah. And admittedly, if it's the right setting, I like calling on him and identifying him, one, because it's just real and it's who we are, and it's who I am. But I have had so many encounters with parents and families and grandparents, siblings of deceased little ones. And so it can be, in a deeper sense, in a non-transactional business setting, it can be a very real way of just knowing one another and having, letting all of the worldly concerns or the silly small talks just kind of fall by the wayside and feeling like this is real. What's real is that difficult things happen, but we're still joyful. And sometimes there's a really good mirroring there.
And it's amazing what comes to light if you do mention that openly, and what kind of baggage people are carrying and what kind of wounds are there. And, it's everyone has them in some form. And so it's a connection point. The interesting thing as well is that our kids are actually, I think, more bold in saying it than we are at this point, because like I will say 6, and then inevitably one of our kids will speak up and say, oh, but they're 7 because Clark's in heaven. I'm like, yes, thank you. And then now the conversation has gone forward from that point. So God bless them, because there's probably points where I should mention him more often, and my kids make sure that they do. So it's pretty sweet.
That's really cool that you've obviously created an environment where Clark is still very much a part of your family. And so they feel compelled to be able to talk about that, right? Like they feel like it's safe and okay to do that. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
Really sweet. He's the perfect child. That's what I tell them.
Yeah. You should live up to that.
Yeah. Your perfect brother in heaven would not be impressed with your behavior right now.
I think that often about the 4-year-old, because he came after Emily, right? And so I'm like, in some ways.
Yeah, that's funny.
Oh, man. So how do you guys relate to other parents who have not had the kind of loss that you have? Like, how has that dynamic changed? Like, sometimes maybe you had friends before, and then sometimes that relationship maybe is different after you've had the loss. They're like, they don't know how to talk to you, or, just the dynamics can sometimes change depending on if you're with parents who have experienced the same loss as you. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I would say some of our friendships were for a season. And even when we got pregnant with Clark and he was diagnosed, it was clear like some families just couldn't really handle that subject, or kind of took a step back, I think, because we were uncomfortable, we were in pain, and it was probably just kind of a reminder of, we weren't the type to invite to a party at the time and to complain to, about small, minuscule issues. And so I'm sure that there was a sense of we're gonna let them go through this because we can't relate and we feel bad. And there were a couple of friendships like that that I don't harbor any bad feelings towards. It was just like I see that as a season, and a certain shallowness to our relationship. And nowadays, I would say for a lot of our friends, we've been honest and vulnerable about our son's life and the fact that he motivates a lot of what we do. But even so, it's a lonely road, I think, unless someone has truly been through it like you, which creates a very deep bond, a very real understanding of your morbid sense of humor or your coping skills or whatever it is. Unless they really get it, it can be a lonely road and not something that really comes up too much. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there are certain people who are naturally inclined to be deep thinkers or deep feelers that can maybe relate even if they haven't been through something difficult like this. But those are few and far between in some ways, who are really in touch with kind of the heart, other people's hearts, and have like an empathy that really is able to kind of feel things with others. But in general, it takes a little bit of time, honestly, to get to a point in friendships where there's kind of they're starting to understand who we are and what drives us, because it is just kind of such a deep-seated inspiration at this point and deep-seated scar that continues to kind of be present. That's a part of us. And again, not something you'd ever wish on somebody else, but can be difficult to interact with folks who maybe don't have that kind of scarring, so to speak,
Yeah. I've always said it's the club you never want to join, but you're glad you're not the only member.
Yeah.
It totally is isolating. And if people don't get it, it can, it's just really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And those who do try to get it, I have so much respect for them. I had a beautiful mom of one of my students bring us flowers to the school on the anniversary of our son's passing just this last year. And it's been 10 years since he died. And for me, of course, it will always be like a very important day. I'm always weepy, leading up to this time. But to have someone on the outside who I'm not even terribly close with remember us and make that just act of charity, it was so touching. I was like, man, I want to be like that lady someday who's just thinking so outside of herself that she would even remember something like this. So it was very sweet.
I love that. I always try to make a reminder in my calendar of people's important dates for that express reason, because I know how much it means to me when somebody remembers mine. Even, years down the road, I think a lot of times people on the outside figure, oh, it's been a couple of years, they're past it, or, it's not as real for them. Like, even if, the friends that maybe experienced it with you, or were like really there for you during that time or whatever, they obviously remember, but even still sometimes, even they can kind of distance over time, and so when somebody remembers, no matter how many years it's been, it means a lot. And so, So tell me about your current work and how your grief has influenced what you guys are doing right now. Like, talk to me about the intersection of your grief and what you're doing now.
Well, I'll start at the beginning. What's interesting is we lost our son 10 years ago, and then we proceeded to have another son, Lazarus, who actually had a mistaken diagnosis of trisomy 18 early on. And so, there was an interesting grief and trauma there because I immediately went to my child's going to die, and I went numb pretty fast. And, praise God, he ended up being okay. He had a number of cysts on his brain that dissolved over time. He had tested likely in his blood test and then came back very, healthy, but also spent several weeks in the NICU. So Cameron and I both, I think we've had little traumas following where we've actually had 4 kids in the NICU since the loss of our son. And so we've had a long journey of highs and lows and, concern for our babies. And there was one moment after our next son, Ignatius, who we call Nash, where our local pastor came up to me, and at the time Nash was 4 months old, and I would say I was deeply depressed. I was surviving and doing my best. But there was a very real reason why I was like going to church every single day, because it was the one place where I felt like heaven and earth could meet and I could just be real with God, and then also go just beg for his grace to get through each day, right? So very heavy time. And our priest, Father Mariusz, comes up to me at the end of Mass one day and said, I've been praying about who to hire for our next church secretary, and for some reason, your face keeps popping up. And I'm like, I'm in a deep, dark place with a very tired, screaming 4-month-old. And I'm like, how on earth would I ever work for you, let alone, serve a valuable purpose here? And he proceeded to then say, it's a difficult job. One day you're serving a new couple who's excited to get married, and the next day you're helping someone bury their child or their spouse. And when he said that, I was like, I'm in, because that's where my heart's at. I'm watching my kids grow, and it's an exciting and wonderful time. And death is constantly on my heart, and I'm ready to go home, So I said yes to that job, and I actually think that was a real turning point in what Cam and I decided to do with our lives and with our kids. So I worked for the church for a time. COVID happened. I mean, it's just been one thing after another of trying to discern God's will. And once I worked for the church, I realized there were many, many children and many, many moms and dads who were trying to be very thoughtful and intentional in their lives, but who didn't have like the community or the school essentially to support them in that family life. So we started a co-op. At the time, it was very much myself starting the co-op because Cameron was working in manufacturing and shift work, difficult work. But I started this little co-op, and that became a very robust hybrid, classical hybrid co-op at the church that's still operational, which Cameron has since directed. And we have 100 children and 70 children on the wait list, and it's been beautiful. We've had special celebrations for loss of life, and many of our moms have either miscarried, or we have some who lost children at a much later age, as late as 5 years old. And so there's a very real loving community that's blossomed out of this. And then going on 4 years ago, our 8th graders needed a high school as they were graduating from this co-op. And I also saw a lot of darkness for our teens in this community. And believe it or not, I linked it to our son Clark, because he was given this incompatible with life diagnosis. And I'm reading the news and the stats, and it's like 2021. And I look at Cameron and I'm like, these teenagers are getting an incompatible with life diagnosis. They're committing suicide at higher rates than ever, and depression rates and tech use are just like robbing them of their joy. And so we felt very compelled to start a high school out of that as well. So we're actually 2 educational institutions into this journey in honor of our son. And there have been a lot of highs and lows throughout, but in our mission statement for the high school, the last tagline is actually in honor of Clark, and it just says, "Heaven is our mission." And I always think of him, and I always feel inspired by that motivation that we would all just enjoy heaven together one day. It's been a wild 10 years, let's just say.
And it's another one of those things, kind of like when people ask you how many kids you have, it's, what is the actual engine that drives us and some of the inspiration that we're doing. And it's Clark in many ways. It's just not everyone fully knows that at this point, because we're not going to, put that out public necessarily unless people are ready to hear it. But essentially, he is the one who's kind of inspired all of the action behind what we've done the last 5 or 6 years, and hopefully the good that has come, and the unity that's happened, and the community that's been built. And so it's really actually incredible. I mean, we were, I think, how old was I? 26, maybe at the time, 26 and 23 when Clark passed away, 27 maybe. And we basically aged like 10 years overnight. And, that maturity has kind of stuck with us a little bit in how we operate and how we want to see how we see the world. And Clark is kind of driving all of that as far as how we are trying to build something for the next life. And, not everyone fully knows that. I sat down with one of the other dads recently. We've had a coffee together, and he was like, just tell me more about why are you doing this? What are you doing? Why are you doing all of this? And then so I'm like, oh, well, there's an open door. And so I told him a little bit about Clark, and he just, had no idea. And so, some of that, and that's okay. But we know that he's a huge factor in the goodness that's coming from this community.
Yeah. And a few years back, I started reading up on this idea of post-traumatic growth. And I can totally relate in the sense that I don't think our faith or our love for each other and our kids would be as strong if we had not gone through that trauma and loss. But I also like to highlight that does not mean that there aren't and there won't be like more dark nights, more low points. And I'm just now, 10 years later, I feel like I'm starting to learn to give myself grace when I wake up one day and it's just really heavy. And so post-traumatic, I like to add the caveat that post-traumatic growth does not mean that I am just like joyful, bubbly, all is well because God is good and I trust him abundantly. It has been such a journey, and I've actually told good friends and also just people on the street that I am a daily convert, because every morning I wake up and I have to wrestle with the fact that God allowed my child to die even though he is a personal and all-powerful and loving God. And every day I go through that cycle of, and yet he gave his son for us. He did not leave us alone. Even when I didn't see him in my life, he was there. And I have the years, to look back on and to realize that. But God and I are constantly like, are you there? Okay. Are you there? 'Cause I don't feel like you're here. Or if you are here, you're not taking very good care of my heart. There's quite the dialogue and quite the wrestling. But I do believe that when we surrender that pain to something greater, or when we find an avenue of pouring out for others, that is where we can find true healing and growth, even amidst that.
Yeah. I feel like it gives a lot of meaning to the loss, right? Like for me in my grief work, I feel like losing a child is so senseless, right? Especially like an innocent baby, like you lose a child that got in a car accident. Okay, yes, that's senseless, but they had time, and you had time to spend with them. But like a baby just feels so unfair,
Mm-hmm.
and senseless. And when I'm able to help other families through their own loss, it gives it meaning. It makes it not feel so senseless,
Mm-hmm.
Like, yes, this was a really hard thing that I went through and it totally sucks, but I'm able to now help someone else, and that makes mine feel a little bit better. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like
totally.
It almost sounds self-serving, but at the same time, it's really not, because it's helping others to feel that too, And so I'm totally with you.
It's communion, right? Like we go through the good things together and we suffer together. But when we do it together, that's where you can find meaning. And I think when I was wrestling with how unnatural it is for a baby to die, like you said, and it's really hard to point fingers too, right? You usually have no clarity or understanding as to why a child had to die, or anything that you could have controlled to keep that from happening. But I do think that to a real degree, it points to heaven even more, because it shows that this life is so quick and something so small compared to this idea of eternity and what heaven should be. So, wrestling with that conversation, I think it's a very fruitful realization to say, yes, he or she died very young, but they are alive in Christ. And at this point, that pain might be worth helping others to realize that too. That pain, I would never believe that God planned it this way, but I do believe that he permits these things and can work them for the good, when it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I somehow grew up with this notion that, and I think a lot of people might have this, that God gives you your trials, like you always hear that phrase, God won't give you anything more than you can handle, and so I think sometimes that leads us to think that he's like just up there, like, okay, you're going to have this happen and you're going to have this happen. And, like he's moving pawns on a chessboard or something, But I really think that we live in a fallen world, right? Like our bodies are mortal, and that leaves room for chromosomal abnormalities and brains that don't fully form, or, bones that have issues or things, it's mortality. It's a condition of this mortal fallen world. But he's there to help us pick up those pieces and give us that perspective, Something that I was going to ask you guys that came up as we were talking. Do you find that now that you've experienced the death of one child and then you had kids after, and especially with all of the, sounds like more trauma that you had even after that, did you feel like you were, I don't know how to phrase this, afraid to lose another child? Like in my case, after Emily died, I was afraid that Sydney was going to die too, or I was afraid that Henry was going to die too. And not even necessarily just like the anxiety of like something bad is going to happen to them, but just like things that never crossed my mind before. And suddenly, I was very aware of their mortality, and like, okay, this could happen. Like, I'm not safe and insulated anymore. Like, this happened to one of my kids. It could easily happen to any of the rest of them, even though they're older, you know, like obviously it's not going to be from the same cause, but suddenly my kids can die now. Like, this is the world I'm living in, you know? So what was it like for you guys?
You want to start?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely changes your perspective 100%. And at the risk of being maybe like a helicopter parent or like the greenhouse parent, however you say it, you know, we have definitely become more aware of the risks that are out there. And so, you know, pretty consistently, we've seen ourselves be a little bit more careful and a little bit more anxious when it comes to our kids and what we let them do and where they go and who they're with, which is part of the burden, but maybe also a gift, that maybe we wouldn't have had this perspective otherwise. But also, you know, in the same hand, trying to understand the gift of life and how it is just that, a gift that we are honestly giving back to God, and our kids don't even really belong to us, you know, and we're constantly wrestling with that, the internal pull to kind of cling on to them and to keep them safe at all times, but also to let them kind of be adventurous and live their life, and then know that God essentially is who they belong to. And we don't have control over, you know, if they were to die one day or before we did, or whenever that situation comes, like that's not up to us. And so it's a constant wrestle, at least for me.
Yeah. And I would say, yeah, if you talk to me about postpartum times after, you know, all the consecutive children, I've certainly handled it differently each time. And there have been years where death dictated my every move, you know, like fear absolutely at the forefront. And then there was one point with Lazarus where we're in the NICU and he's on my chest and he's plugged into all the things. He's on CPAP and everything else, but I'm giving him that skin to skin. He's in literally the safest place he could possibly be. And he had a Brady, which is when the heart just goes. And all the doctors come running in, and he was just going to go to sleep and die on my chest. It was that simple. And something in me switched where I was just like, I can't control the lives of my children. I can give them everything that I am and everything that I have. But if God decides to call them home, like I have no say in that. And in some ways it killed some of the fear in me. And in other ways, I still had to wrestle with it. And my joke is that God gave us 5 very lively boys, and they try to kill themselves every day. And so at some point, I had to finally give up and just be like, you know what? They're going to climb the tree. They're going to try to jump off the banister. They're going to slam their hand in the door. They're going to punch each other in the face, all the things. 3 of them have asthma. They're going to have asthma attacks. Like, I have to learn to surrender some of this and to enjoy them while they're here. And so I think that's what 10 years has brought us to. And that's what being open to life has brought us to as well. Just being able to have more kids and to take part in the joy, and to just recognize that on this side of things, like, there's little that we can control, and what we can control, you know, hopefully we're just entered in and loving them with everything we have. And I think that's on the positive side. You know, we've let fear dictate a lot. We've also just let that bittersweet understanding that we will not always have each other, for better, for worse. Someone is going to be the first one to die, and someone's going to be the last one to be here. And as hard as that is to try to imagine, it just makes you want to live each day and each hour with all the intentionality and the love that you can cram into it.
I love that. A friend of mine always says she lives her life with one foot on either side of the veil, right? Like, there's one foot here on earth, and she's always got one foot in heaven, you know, because she just is.
I love that.
And actually, I was talking to her one time about how, for me at least, I feel like the fear of death is completely removed from myself, right? Like, I'm not afraid of being in a car accident or, you know, some kind of whatever. Like, if I die, I die. Like, before.
You kind of want it sometimes.
Exactly. Like, before, you know, like, I would be like, oh no, dying is the worst. I don't want to die. And I'm not saying that I want to die now, but what I mean is, because I have a child on the other side, that fear of death is suddenly gone from me. Like if I die, well, yeah, that sucks. I'm going to leave my family here behind, but hey, look what I get, you know, like, and so it's like she said, you know, just living life on one side, either side of the veil. And it reminded me of what you guys said about how Clark is your motivator to, like, you know, live life well and return to be with him, you know. And I feel the same way about our Emily. Like, you know, I just having someone in heaven cheering us on is like a huge motivator, you know. And it makes it not so scary to think about my own demise, because I know what's waiting for me on the other side, you know.
Yeah.
So you guys alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I want to dive in a little bit more. How did this experience affect your relationship with each other? Like, you know, a lot of times people who lose a child, I don't remember exactly what the statistic is, but it's a pretty high number of divorce rate after losing a child. And so talk to me a little bit about like what that was like for you guys in terms of your relationship, and then also maybe how your grief was different from each other and what that was like.
Yeah. Well, I can speak to the grief aspects first. I wanted to mention that a couple things. When we were, when we were pregnant with Clark, you know, it was much, we were doing much different things. You know, in some ways we were both reading more books together. We were praying more, and we were closer, but there was also a difference in kind of how we were handling it. I was in the sense of kind of trying to figure out how to best support Genevieve, or how to best kind of muscle through it, so to speak. And so, but I was also resisting that, because there's a tendency in men, I think, to try to just get through it, or turn an eye, or just like be stronger than what's happening to you. And so my constant prayer the whole time that we were pregnant was that I would like enter in and embrace and feel the pain or the suffering, which every part of my body was telling me not to do. You know, naturally, I think men specifically are like, no, I can get through this, I'm fine, you know. But I know that would be detrimental to both myself and my wife and our relationship. And so it was very important for me to try to make sure that knowing my wife and how much of a feeler she is, and how, you know, how she experiences things, I said, I need to at least get close to her level in experiencing this for the sake of both of us. And so that was my prayer the whole time. And, you know, I did my best to really enter in and own it and embrace every single aspect of that whole pregnancy. And I think that helped. And that's something that I've tried to think about going forward is, you know, men see this differently. And while he's not probably on the front of my mind as much as he is on Genevieve's, I am constantly trying to, again, embrace that cross as best I can, and which will inevitably lead us closer together. And so that's been kind of my aim over the past 10 years. Yeah.
And looking back, I'm so grateful that Cam entered in, and had he not, you have a lot of compassion for couples who really struggle, because if you're going to separate directions, you know, or if you're leaving one behind and you're moving on in life, that would be very, very, very difficult. And we've had our own challenges, but one thing that's always kept us together is that mutual cross, you know, that unseen loss. And Cam had always loved the name Clark back in the day. And even before we named Clark, that was one name he wanted to give one of our kids. And so I remember for a split second that conversation of, well, do we use this name on this kid, even though we know we're not going to have him, you know, for long? And we did. And I felt like that was one of those moments where Cameron really, in his leadership, just embraced the life of his son and owned it. And he could have gone the other direction, you know, so many times. And he could have said to me, you know, let's just get through this, get over it, you know, shove it down. And he didn't. He asked how I was. He tried to motivate and inspire me over the last 10 years, never judging me for the heaviness and the waves of grief that do come. I think the other thing that we did that I would recommend to any couple who is aware of the likelihood of losing their child. Right after we gave birth, we went to a little cabin for 2 or 3 days by ourselves. And that was so good because right when we got there, I wept and I still weep and all the things, but we both wept together and we prayed and we laid there together as man and wife. And it was like the one healing thing that we could have done for our marriage and to just cope with what we just went through, and I think, thank God we had that, and no wonder so many couples don't make it, because if you don't have that intentionality or that faith time or that silence to recognize what you just went through, I can imagine that you sort of bury a lot and that it bubbles out over many, many years. And the other thing I will say is just that, like, for our relationship, once you survive losing a child, it's really easy to write most other arguments off as completely petty and not even worth fighting about, right? We've been through that. I've trusted you with my body and my life and my children. Like, I'm not gonna argue with you about something silly, or we're not gonna let something happening in our lives disrupt our peace. Yeah. Because our peace is not of this world. So
almost like an intolerance to like the pettiness too, both in our own life and our relationship. And then if there's things in the world that, we see people are arguing or fighting over petty things, it just doesn't ring true. It doesn't make sense. And so, that's definitely a big one of it has set aside all arguments that don't matter at this point, basically.
Yeah. Perspective for sure. So let's talk about triggers for a minute. Are there certain triggers or things that bring back waves of grief, and how do you describe them? Like, is there a pattern that you've noticed, or like any kind of things? And then also, like, what do you guys do when you feel triggered? Like, what are some of the things that help you through that?
Yeah. Do you have any triggers, or is that more of the mommy thing? I feel like with each child, that's a new trigger. Pregnancy, birth, postpartum. It's a beautiful, scary, and exciting and lovely mountain to climb. And then there's usually some kind of wave of just absolute grief or exhaustion, because it's all connected. It's my motherhood. It's my body. It's this new life that typically goes to the NICU or isn't breathing for a time. And so I've had a number of dark nights of the soul, I call them, when my baby is born and then taken from me for about 48 hours. And I'm in recovery, and Cameron's with the baby because that's where I want him to be. But I'm very alone. And I always go back to that feeling of being incredibly alone, once my child had died, and having to just sit there and heal and listen to other babies cry in the postpartum wing, and it brings back certain memories that are very painful. And so, to cope, I've just kind of learned to have grace for myself and to let myself weep if I need to weep, or to, ask family or Cameron to bring a treat and bring me a coffee, or maybe don't throw any extra tasks on my plate today, because I need to get through it, and just take some time to either go visit his graveside or go to church, that kind of thing, go for a walk outside. But I think I've noticed in myself that holidays are tough, which is, I find ironic, because he never even spent a holiday with us. Like, where is that expectation coming from? And all I can think is that in my heart, just like C.S. Lewis talks about, we long for something that we've never quite experienced yet, because we were made for that. So we long for heaven. I think I long for moments, especially during the holidays, for our whole family to be together and for everything to be right with the world, And so I have to learn to recognize that that's the heaven banquet. We're not there yet. And then it always reminds me to just really be grateful for the family that we do have, or the opportunity that we do have to celebrate that holiday together, and to not let the worldly things get in the way, I've never sweat the small stuff like, do we have the cranberry sauce for the turkey? It's more like, are we cuddling on the couch enough as a family? And are we playing games and laughing and enjoying the process? So,
yeah.
For
me, it's honestly an ongoing challenge, I think, for most men too, in their grieving process of turning it off, because it's kind of easy to just kind of get numb to it and just turn that side of your heart off or close it off, so it doesn't hurt. And so it's honestly a constant challenge for me to keep that part of my heart open and allow it to be pierced. And there are certain times that happens more than others. Movies with kids and certain, where they're sick or, even in success stories with kids and movies, those hit a lot harder. Certain songs hit a lot harder. And so those things that kind of pierce the heart every once in a while and kind of bring back those reminders of what we've been through, and it kind of reopens a tiny bit of the wound. And, I'm thankful for it though. Interestingly, it's not like something I shy away from, because I welcome the reminder and the pain that it brings, because it is, again, like we talked about before, kind of a beautiful torture that we went through. And it's something that we don't want to forget. And so as much as like mentally, I try to shut it off, it's, I try to keep it open for those kinds of moments, because it does still inspire and still kind of makes you feel alive in some ways.
I love that. Sometimes people are insensitive to someone who is grieving and maybe say things that are less than helpful, not intentionally, of course, but so can you guys share any times or experiences and maybe what would have been helpful instead? Like what actions or ideas would you suggest to someone who's trying to help someone who's grieving?
I didn't have too many terrible experiences, thankfully. People were very charitable. Our family really entered in with us. They didn't have to do that, but they did.
Mm-hmm.
So I always kind of, if they said something unknowingly, I always kind of wrote it off as they just really can't know because they haven't experienced this, but they're here and they're trying to be a part of the conversation. I did have one strange thing happen where a friend of mine from childhood emailed me, and it was supposed to be a consoling message, but she basically said, "This is happening for your own salvation, and it needed to happen." So, like basically, I'm not recalling the verbiage because when I read it, I remember being like, "Are you kidding me, Smalls? Like you're telling me that God is willing the death of my child because I'm so bad that this is what it took to purify me." Now that I have perspective, I'm like, we all have the crosses that we bear that hopefully help us get to heaven or help us to slowly burn away our selfishness or our control on life and things like that. But this lady kind of had the audacity to say, "This is happening for your salvation, and I'm so sorry that it's happening, but somewhere there's consolation in that," right? And I would never, there are certain church isms, right? Like Jesus doesn't give you more than you can handle. This cross was made for you, right? For your salvation. And I would steer clear of, especially with the loss of a child where it feels very unnatural, so how can you tie it to anyone but God? At that point, I would steer away from church language that might assume that the reason behind the suffering, or that you are playing God in this statement. And people will say they'll say a verse to try to get you through life, and there are certain verses that I also think are overused or mistakenly used. I had to wrestle with the Jeremiah one where I know the plans I have for you, right? That they're good and
to prosper you and not to harm you or whatever.
Yeah, not to harm you and all these things. And it's like, that is a beautiful verse. And I do believe that is where God is coming from in our creation and all of that. But I don't know that I would use that for a mom who is literally being like beaten to a pulp in her motherhood at the moment, right? I do, in hindsight, I do love the verse that God will work all things for the good of those who love him. So it's recognizing that not all things are good that happen to you, but he can work them for the good. And I do believe that, but I also wouldn't even use that verse until there's been quite some time for healing, for processing through things.
Yeah. So
it's usually the best thing to say, the least traumatizing thing to say is just that I'm so sorry you're going through this. And that if you need anything, even just a friend or even just someone to cry with or to process this with, I'm here for you. And then you say that knowing that you need to be there for them if they take you up on it,
Yeah. I think an authentic response in charity, it goes a long ways. We almost feel like obligated sometimes in the church world to just say, I'm praying for you. I hope you're doing better. Let me know if you need anything, and that's just kind of a platitude to make us feel better, more or less. Right. And, but the powerful ones that I experienced were when men would come up and look me in the eye and with emotion that you could tell that they were actively feeling or trying to feel what we were going through, and gave me a real hug, took my hand and said, I'm here if you need anything, and looked me in the eye. And you can tell when someone's being authentic in that action, or if they're just saying it because that's what they're supposed to say. So that was really powerful for me. And then the other one I would say is like like when her friend gave her the flowers this year, the long-term remembrance to know that like you're walking through this with them, you get a lot of flood of help and friends coming at you in the first few months, but then kind of crickets after that. And so the longer term walk with you in this struggle is very powerful as well.
I totally agree. I once heard it likened to getting an epidural, right? Like right after the event happens, you're just kind of numb, and everybody's there and they're supporting you and you feel like, okay, I can do this. I got this. I mean, maybe a little, you feel supported and people are there.
Yeah.
But then, as time goes on and the epidural wears off and everybody's gone, then you're really acutely aware of just how painful this really is, And so I totally agree. Like you said, like keep showing up even after it's been 10, 15, 20 years, like just keep remembering, keep showing up. I'm glad you brought up the thing about scriptures and just kind of the faith expectations and like the faith culture of grief, because I also struggled with, I liked to call it faith-splaining, right? Where someone would try to explain my grief away with faith. And, like, oh, just if you pray more or read your scriptures or, like they were well-meaning, of course, but just throwing gospel at me as though that was going to magically fix it, and I really struggled with that a lot because I was like, yes, the gospel is what's getting me through, and my belief in Jesus and the scriptures and all of these things, yes, these are helping me, they're getting me through. But when you tell me, well, at least you know where she is, or you're going to see her again, or all of those things, like, yeah, I know that in my core. And that's the one thing that's getting me through the day. But hearing you say it the way that you're saying it makes me feel like I'm not allowed to also be sad about it, right? Like I should just be glad that I get to see her again, but I can't also in the same moment be really sad right now. And I really
at least is not a good thing to say.
Yes, never, ever, ever. Don't say that.
Yeah.
If it begins with at least, just don't even. But earlier when you mentioned that your son's name was Lazarus, that struck a chord with me because one of my most favorite stories of Jesus was about Lazarus, because he knew that Lazarus was going to be raised from the dead. He knew that. He was about to do it, right? But he still wept. And if he can weep knowing what's coming, then gosh dang it, I'm allowed to weep too. Like it feels validating for me. And so I'm glad to hear you bring that up, because I feel like a lot of people, especially in the faith community, are probably feeling that same way, that if you're grieving, then somehow your faith isn't strong enough. And that's just not true. Like grief is a human experience, and Jesus felt it, right? Like if he can feel it, then we're certainly allowed to feel it too, and feeling grief doesn't negate faith. They can coexist, and they do coexist. It's a very unique experience. And I think that was one of the things that I wasn't prepared for in grief, was how I could feel two seemingly opposing emotions at the exact same time, right? Yeah. I could feel happy and sad. I could feel joy and grief. I could feel fear and faith, right? Because, a lot of times we're told like, oh, faith and fear can't coexist. And, sometimes, sometimes, yeah. So
the funeral pictures we have, we're smiling and beaming, like the sun's shining. Our 2-year-old is there. Cameron and I are there, like literally burying our son and smiling. And I can't explain it other than, joy and suffering can go hand in hand when heaven is a reality. And I've seen friends, and I've been tempted myself to grieve and to turn it in on myself and to make it a selfish thing. So I do think that grief can become bigger than it ought to be sometimes, and it's not me judging, it's just like, I think we can't solve it ourselves. So the more we turn in on ourselves, the more of a hell we kind of create in that grief. And I think that selfishness can take root, and it can make the grief that much worse. But when we grieve through it while recognizing, that we have to continue to kind of die to self in that space, then God gives you the meaning, and he gives you healing, and he gives you a sense of purpose. But I do remember there were stages in my mourning, and I'm sure hormones are involved and all the things, but there were times where I don't know if anyone could say anything right, because I was so bitter and broken and that kind of thing. And so you do kind of have to come to grips with it between you and God. I think you have to duke it out a little bit. You have to forgive. You have to move into it and recognize that you're not alone. And then I feel like that's when the grief is in the right place. It's not owning your life so much. It's more inspiring.
Absolutely. Yeah. So looking back, can you guys identify anything that may have helped prepare you emotionally or spiritually to survive this experience? Like, maybe earlier in your life, or kind of you alluded to it earlier, of your foundations of faith growing up and things like that. Just, was there anything where you can look back and be like, oh yeah, this experience totally helped me for this,
Well, I went through a number of things growing up that, for better or worse, they were traumatic, and I think they kind of prepared me for staying calm and cool and collected as I could have been, kind of taking it one step at a time. My dad was a cop, so he brought home all kinds of, brutal stories that I'm sure I wasn't supposed to hear, but would listen in. And my mom had brutal health, and I almost lost a little sister who was born prematurely. So there were multiple times where I almost lost a sibling or my mom. And so death was kind of, I've even said this to God, like, death is kind of my kryptonite, and God has continued to give me doses of this fear, and I've had to really learn to kind of be less afraid, or to embrace it, as a reality. And you're talking to me on a good day. Sometimes it's not a good day. And I'm like, if I have to outlive everyone that I love, I'm going to be so disappointed, because I want to go first. I don't want to go through grief again. God, be nice to me and don't make me go through all of this. There are days like that. But I think just our formation in the faith, and then surviving hard times as a family, like it did teach me to cling to family and to cling to God in the hard things. And I don't know how you do that without actually just having to go through them as a child. Of course, I have a favorite book that I like to recommend philosophically, and it's called Making Sense of Suffering. And it's by Dr. Peter Kraft. And he just kind of walks through what reality would look like if God was maybe all powerful, but not all loving, or all loving, but not all powerful, or personal, but, incapable of being outside of space and time. It's like a very philosophical thing, but I've really fallen back on that when I've doubted whether or not God love me personally or love my child, and why that can somehow coexist. So some of that deeper philosophy and meaning has helped us, I think, foundationally, not to blame God for these things.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I didn't really grow up with a lot of trauma, honestly. I had a pretty good childhood, thanks be to God and thanks to my parents. But I think something I've reflected on that may have helped is just doing hard things. And for me, that was mostly in sports, as silly as that may sound, but pushing myself and pushing through suffering and pain in order to embrace it for a goal that's farther ahead. And so it was a blessing and a curse, because my mind and body automatically went to that, where it's like you get through it. But I was also prepared for it because I've been through hard things before, at least physically, and then, mentally trying to overcome that. And so the challenge for me at that point was trying to embrace it and allow my emotions and my spirituality to enter into the game rather than just physically and mentally. So kind of the whole body being a part of it rather than just physically. So that would be something that I think was somewhat of a preparation in my sense. So
we're trying to raise our kids similarly too, right? Because life will happen to them and hard things are bound to happen. And even the students that we have, like I look around the room and some of them are going to lose their children or their loved ones or their best friend, like you're also not spared death as a teenager. So I'm just sitting here thinking in the back of my mind, like, how do we not harden their hearts, but also prepare them for the challenges that are to come and to embrace that with joy? And I just think that takes a lot of walking alongside and, journeying through life together and talking about hard things, but maintaining that peace and that like go get 'em attitude. That's kind of what we're working on as a couple at home and in the entities that we run, is raising people who are prepared for difficult times, but also very joyful. Again, that heavenly mission on the forefront. So
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how would you guys say that you have changed as individuals with this experience? Like, how are you different than you were before?
Well, I think just kind of the different perspective we have in how we act, how we talk to people, what we talk about, what we do with our lives, how quickly we get to a state of depth, I guess, or how quickly we get to conversing in a sense of depth. And then, I mean, honestly, I would say there's kind of always a sense of like, it's not morose, but there's a sense of death always on the mind. In the Catholic tradition, there's a term called memento mori, and it's referring to always kind of keeping your death in mind, and not in a strange or even like a sad way or despairing way, but in the sense of like always keeping in mind that you will one day return to dust, and what does that look like for your life today? So I think that always kind of hangs over us in some sense, which is again a blessing and a curse, because it makes it hard to relate to some of the fun things that people do in life, and we find ourselves not quite enjoying some of the smaller, simpler joys, and so we're working on that actively. But it also is something that again has driven us and keeping us with that perspective. So it's been good as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, I think there are times where I romanticize what life might have looked like if Clark had never existed, or if he had been born healthy and perfect and with us. And I still don't choose it, even though it's like painful to admit. I think that God, in his omniscience, truly did know what we needed in order to make a very real impact in the world and to love our kids who are with us. I don't think our faith would have been near as strong. I don't think our love would have been as strong. It would have been just more worldly, more shallow. But I also sometimes crave, like, what would we be doing? Yeah. How goofy would we be? Like, would we laugh at things more lightheartedly? And would we, I think that there are things that we need to actively grow in as a couple and as a family, so that we are not completely dictated by this idea of death and loss and everything else. So like, I embrace it, but I also recognize that we still have growing to do as a couple, and I should be excited to live for many more years and to watch the grandchildren and to watch life unfold, where my initial gut reaction is just like, I don't want to have more years to potentially lose those that I love, or to just be over this whole situation, this life. And I think that is another stage of grief where we're coping and we're doing well, but is there a lightness that we have found and an acceptance? And I think we still have work to do there. So we're utterly changed. We're different people, while still being the same. Our marriage is different. But I also, looking back, I have no idea what burdens or challenges we would have been faced with had we not been pushed immediately to realize like how quick life is and how painful it is to lose a child. And I mean, who knows? We might be fighting over the hamper or the toothpaste or the silly things, right?
Yeah.
So I am right with reality in choosing this, like what we've been given. But there are times where I romanticize, like running through a field of flowers, laughing, and just completely oblivious to the pains of life. And yeah, that would be fun for about a day, probably, and then we'd fight about the toothpaste. So
yeah.
I could totally identify with what you were saying about fantasizing how things would be different. I feel the same way with our experience. There's always this dual reality, right? Where what would happen if she was still here and she didn't have trisomy 18? And what would life look like if she was still here, but she did have it, right? And those two realities are both so vastly different that it's hard to spend a lot of time on either of them, because the reality where she's alive is hard and sad, because I know that that's not going to be in this world, right? So then I can't spend too much time thinking about that, because then it makes me sad, right? But then I also can't spend too much time thinking about the reality of her living and having it, because I know how hard that was and what her life probably would have looked like with all of the medical interventions and the constantly worrying if today was going to be the day that she died. And, so like neither of those two scenarios ever bring me any joy. So the only one that I can cling to is the one that I know is going to happen when I die, which is just like you said, like, part of me is like, I don't want to keep living and have to deal with all of this. Like, take me whenever, it's okay, cause I'm ready to go have that life instead, I am ready for what I know is waiting. But like I said, like you said, it's not like you're trying to be morose or, negative about it. It's just, that's where your heart is when you've lost someone so young and important to you. Like, you just can't wait to get there.
Yeah. And finding out how to enjoy the meantime,
Yes.
How to embrace and enjoy the meantime it's a real thing. We're still learning.
Totally. So the last question that we always like to ask people is, what do you think it means to grieve well?
Well, I think going back to what I was saying about how grief can take you to an interior selfish place that feels dead, ultimately. I do think that there is such thing as grieving poorly. And I say that without judging, because I don't blame them for it, right? It's very tempting. And I also think that the world can sometimes give you all the tools to grieve poorly, whether it's numbing yourself through, drugs or distraction or alcohol, whatnot. Like, there are means of ignoring your grief. I think there are also ways of turning that grief into something that's solely about you, or that's, completely internal and blocking God's grace or the need for community. And I say that in a non-judgmental way, that's not the right way to grieve. To label what is the right way. That's harder for me to do, because I think depending on what the grief is, depending on the situation, like who knows how much time is the right time, you know? And I brought it up at my staff meeting that I was leading recently. It was the day of Clark's anniversary. And I still absolutely bubbled up in tears and apologized. I'm like, I'm sorry. You'd think by 10 years I'd have these tears together, but I don't. And so, but I think there's an authenticity in allowing our body and soul to continue to grieve if that's where we are. So I don't know that I can label the right way to grieve other than, I mean, bringing God into it. And for those who really struggle with God, at least letting your heart stay open always, so that if and when he decides to interrupt your life, you're receptive to it. I can't imagine grieving without God, even though I've had my dark nights. But it's either all or nothing, right? Like, if God's not in the picture, why are you feeling these feelings? Like, why do you have the expectation that we're supposed to live forever? And, you just lost a material being that you would never see again anyway. So it's a very dead-end road while it's tempting. But I think the right way is just to keep an open heart and to stay soft, as hard as that is. It's easy to go into self-protection mode, to try to distance potential for more pain, you know. But I think maintaining that soft heart and then trying to break your heart open outwards towards others as a meaningful way of looking outside of yourself. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I would speak similarly for men as well, and allowing it to impact you. Again, men have a tendency in general to kind of shield themselves from suffering and hurt, or the emotional side of pain, and embrace the more physical side. But I would say grieving well, as far as a man is concerned, is allowing it to pierce your heart and impact your relationships, rather than it just making you numb or angry, which is kind of a common instinct that men have when it comes to emotional pain.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you guys so much for sharing your story with me. I loved hearing the perspective and hearing your stories about Clark and how you were able to find peace in the midst of all of your grief. That's really a beautiful story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And it was nice to get to know you and to hear a little bit about Emily. I'd love to hear more sometime over coffee. But it's a good thing you guys are doing. I think in terms of grieving, out in the community, it's all the more important for those who are suffering to know that they're not alone, and to learn from the mistakes and the tools that we've all used to get through that.